Hello. Howdy. So this is a session on tutorials and player onboarding. I've called the stream on YouTube "How to Teach Players How to Play Your Game" because I think the big theme here really is going to be that a tutorial is not just this block of content that goes. A tutorial is a block of content that goes at the beginning of your game, but for most games that is insufficient. And approaching sort of teaching people how to play your game with a more holistic idea of what you're trying to do is often going to yield a better result than just sort of making the game and then putting this bit at the beginning of the game that explains it, which is what we often think of when we talk about a tutorial. So as always, feel free to leave questions or comments in the chat as we go along. I'm going to put some pit stops throughout the slides to actually look at the questions and see if there's anything relevant that's come up since the last time we've looked at it. And this is pipped as a lecture, and videos or streams I've done like this before have kind of taken this sort of university lecture format, but there's not going to be loads and loads of new information here for lots of you. I think a lot of it will feel more like a pep talk. It will feel more like, here is stuff you probably already know you should be doing, and I'm just going to reinforce why. So I haven't gone into like loads and loads. I haven't done what I've done previously and gone and mined loads of GDC talks for references and sort of synthesized them. We're going to talk a little bit about how people learn, a little bit how people kind of pass information, and some terms that go along with tutorial that you should perhaps be thinking about before you get to the point where you're actually designing a tutorial. So thank you all for joining. And as usual, if you are a Patreon subscriber, the slides and the sort of free to watch ad-free version of this will be up on the Patreon as a kind of thank you to everyone who supports the channel that way. So keywords for today are going to be tutorial, obviously. Fatui might be something that comes up. Fatui means first time user experience. You'll hear it a lot more in kind of commercial development. And it's really just, exactly what it sounds like. What does a player experience the first time they pick up their game? And these can be very different from each other, because when we talk about tutorial, we tend to think of a discrete set of content that is made to teach the game. First time user experience can include things like, what do you hide from the player in their first playthrough, right? And to give an example of a bad example of this in practice, one of the things I've seen a few times with games that have been sent in is games with different modes where, as a playtester, I open up that game and I don't know which mode is kind of the main mode for the game. I don't know what the core experience of the game is meant to be. And when a game sort of opens its first time user experience with 3 modes to pick from, it often tells me as a player, it communicates that you don't really know what the core of your game is, right? So that's an example of something where the first time user experience might be just about hiding other content from the game, so that we say, right, this content is mid-game or late-game content. It's not for players to sort of stumble into on their first-time user experience, so we'll hide it, right? So tutorial, we tend to think of, explicitly telling the player stuff, content that is made to tell the player stuff about how to play the game. First-time user experience includes that. It includes the tutorial, although the tutorial might go on for longer than one session. But it also includes things we do to structure the game to make sure that the first-time user experience doesn't have any overwhelming elements. It doesn't include that additional mode that you don't need to know about yet. It doesn't include just anything that's not relevant to the first session and onboarding the player. And we have the concept of onboarding as well, which again is a more general idea of like trying to get the player into the game. And that can include things like the tutorial bit. It can also include like more kind of pleasure-oriented stuff, like how do you introduce the player into playing the game in a way that encourages them to start having fun with the game, in a way that encourages them to immerse themselves in the world of the game, and to start thinking in the way that the game needs them to think, right? So, for example, if you have a game that is meant to involve lots of lateral thinking, like a hardcore puzzle game, and you tutorialize too much, you're not really onboarding the player into the way of thinking that they're going to need in order to play the game well later on. And this is one of the reasons why Dark Souls or FromSoft games, because like Elden Ring does this as well, a lot of those games start you off with an unbeatable boss and kill you straight away, right? That's not a tutorial. I mean, it's tutorializing dying and the death loop, but it's onboarding you into the tone and general approach of the game and saying, right, this is a game where there's going to be a thing that's bigger than you and it's going to kill you a bunch of times. And that might be considered, in lots of places, that might be considered bad game design, killing the player straight away. But it's onboarding them into what the actual full experience is. And then the last thing on this list is just a sort of learning psychology concept that I want you to think about a little bit, which is something called chunking. If you've read Raf Costa's Theory of Fun for Game Design, which is our book on the Game Developers Library this month, we're going to be talking a little bit about chunking there, but I kind of put it in here because it's very relevant to how people learn how to play a game. And like I said, there's going to be checkpoints throughout this where, you guys in the chat ask questions whenever you want, but I'm going to have these slides positioned sort of at breaks throughout the lecture so that I can have specific times to go and look at the chat and see what people are asking. And then that just means we don't break the flow of the slides too much, but we keep it interactive on some level. Also makes it a lot easier for me to edit this later on if I need to. So let's take an example of a game that I think has quite poor onboarding but can get away with it. Anyone play Fire Emblem Three Houses? So this is a game that it doesn't let you do the core gameplay of the game for a very long time in its onboarding. It sort of onboards you into the visual novel character relationship side of the game for a very long period of time, and you don't really get to do the tactical combat very much in your first hour of playing Fire Emblem, and it completely kind of threw me off, right? But Fire Emblem can get away with doing that. Fire Emblem can get away with doing things that some players find really annoying and obnoxious because it has the kind of brand power of being a Fire Emblem game, and people will just want to play it because it's a Fire Emblem game. So you will find examples of games that break all of the good practice we're going to talk about here, but you have to remember that those games are often kind of being made in a context where people are gonna buy them and play them regardless. And if you've bought a Switch game, you're gonna sit through the tutorial. Whereas a lot of the times, if you're making a small time game on Steam and you annoy people within the first 2 hours of the game, they're going to refund the game. So it's a very, very different context, and that's why we kind of need to think about our onboarding in a more thoughtful way. And it's also unlikely that you have the sort of IP where people are going to be tolerant of like hearing an hour of story and not getting to play your game. So when we think about like first time user experience and onboarding a player, yes, we want there to be story if this is a game with a story, but we want to kind of merge these things so that you're learning to play the game, you're being introduced to the world of the game at the same time, and you're being onboarded into the tone of the game or the kind of way of thinking that the game requires you to do. But before we get there, I just need to go over here because this Animal Crossing character is in the way. Or I could do this. And if I just... There we go. So the big caveat before we talk about too much of this is that I see a lot of games that are still in quite an early prototype stage where the developer has tried to put quite a robust tutorial into them. And I would encourage you to think about whether your game needs a tutorial at the stage of development it's at. So are you making a tutorial because video games have tutorials, or because you've tested the game a lot and you've seen what players struggle to understand and then you've built a tutorial around teaching those things? I'll go over here now. So this is a big caveat, and like I always try and put these kinds of caveats in because people that watch this channel could be at all different stages of their game development. And, if you watch or if you read any kind of content about game design, then it will give you like the idealized tutorial. This is what a tutorial must do. and you might have a game that's completely undercooked. You haven't really worked out what the game is yet, and you think, well, this is what the tutorial should do, and games have a tutorial, so I need to do that straight away. If you're in the early stages of making your game, maybe you don't need to think about this yet. And we were talking about this on the Discord earlier. When you've got early adopters of a thing, whether it's a game or a technology, those people tend to be a bit more tolerant of having to learn things for themselves and stuff like that. So if you're still in the first couple of months of a project and you're sending it to people to playtest, do the bare minimum to teach them how to play the game. You know, put information on the itch page, put some guidance in the game, like a thing on the wall that tells you the controls or whatever. But maybe don't go to all the effort of making a big kind of dialogue-driven story tutorial or anything like that until you know that the core gameplay needs it. And then once you're at that stage, you can start to think about, okay, what concepts in the game do people struggle with? Because if your game hasn't been playtested a lot and you haven't got a sense of, you know, when people play it, which things are intuitive, which are not, you probably shouldn't be designing the tutorial yet because you don't know what people need to learn. You know, and this is the same with any kind of teaching, really. Like when you're teaching in a classroom, you have cohorts, you have a bunch of students come in every year, and you generally get a sense of which things they struggle to learn and so on. The difference there is you're teaching the same thing every time, whereas when you're designing games, each of your games is a different thing, unless you're lucky enough to kind of build a franchise of a series of games that have the same concepts in them, and then you can teach the same thing over and over again. But with a game, you sort of need to understand what people need to learn in order to play the game. And some of that might not be obvious to you as the designer. So you kind of need to learn from the playtesters, you know, which things are intuitive and which are not. So I think the workflow for thinking about tutorials and onboarding of players really should be, you know, you try and make sure that the game mechanics make as in much inherent sense as possible, right? So, you know, Time Cowboy that was on the stream last week has some kind of wall jumping stuff. And we were talking in the Discord the other day about maybe the wall jump needs a little bit more feedback. It needs some sound effect when you kick off the wall. It needs a little puff of smoke when you kick off the wall. The camera needs to tilt. All of those things to make the mechanics intuitive and self-explanatory. And the more that you build that into the core design of the game, the less you need to have a pop-up box that comes up and says, hey, you just did a wall jump or whatever, right? So it's the kind of show don't tell thing, but applied to an interactive context where you want people to do the thing. So you kind of want the thing to be as intuitive as absolutely possible before you start putting in instruction that kind of directly tells you. The second one here, and I'll give you some examples of this later on in the talk. I've tried to kind of keep this kind of clean and clear at the moment, but does the game feature the kind of explainers and reminders where needed? So Jokesters in the chat from Arcane Drifter, and an example of those in your game would be like the tells on the card, right? So you have a visual shortcut that explains something, like this does more damage or anything like that. All of those little kind of helper mechanics that allow you to understand the situation you're currently in as a player, those are things that kind of help the player to learn the game way like deeper into the game, right? So examples of this would be things like keyword pop-ups on card games. Like Slay the Spire has this, Hearthstone has this. If there is a mechanical concept like strength, whenever I see the word strength on a card, there is also a little pop-up that gives an explainer that shows what strength is. And it doesn't take up loads of space. I can totally ignore it if I want to, but it's always there. And that means that if I've gone through the tutorial and I've put the game down for months and I need to be re-onboarded, I can see that information again and I've got less to kind of relearn in order to be able to play the game because it's kind of always available, right? So this is all to say that your tutorial and the design of your tutorial should only really come after you've ensured these first 2 points, right? So are the mechanics kind of inherently sensible? Do your mechanics make sense because of the way that things are animated, because of the way that things look, because of the way that things kind of interact when you pick them up and drag them about? All of that kind of stuff is going to be there to sort of explain what is happening in your game, how it works. Does your game feature these kind of persistent explainers, things like tooltips, things like in-world information, like, you know, in a platformer, it could be the classic thing of like putting a little diagram on a wall or having a sign in the game, rather than anything that kind of interrupts the experience, something that the player can go and interact with at their own pace. And then the tutorial should sort of fill in the gaps once you've done all of those other things. And the benefit of doing it this way is, as I said, these things at the top, they can be helpful for re-onboarding a player who hasn't played for a long time. Whereas if they've got a save game halfway through your game, they're not going to get to redo the tutorial, right? And you can solve that many different ways, but I would still start from the assumption that, you know, your game is not the only game that someone plays, and they're going to take breaks, and your game needs to be as self-explanatory in its own right before you worry about this kind of tutorial, discrete set of tutorial content that appears in the first-time user experience, right? I think this is actually really uncanny when you put us side by side. I should have put a sort of beige cardigan on today. They're the same picture. Another one to think about, and some of you will be working on this already or working on it constantly, is that there's like a, you know, in storytelling we talk about narrative devices, right? Like different little tools that you have in your toolkit of things you can do to tell a story. Like a flashback is a narrative device. A voiceover is a narrative device. These are all different ways of giving information and sort of injecting it into a story to give a particular type of animation or to give information in a way that feels a particular way. So you can kind of apply that here, of the idea of like teaching tools or tutorial devices. Like, what are all the different tools that you could have in your toolkit to teach your game? And some of these will be persistent throughout the game, right? So up here, this is an example of those card tooltips that I talked about with Hearthstone. These are not on the card. The card is here in imaginary space, but that card obviously has these two keywords on. And again, I may be a new player, I may be a lapsed player, but this is an example of a kind of teaching tool that the game has that is relevant to me at like any potential stage of me playing the game, not just the tutorial at the start. We've also got dialogue that is part of the tutorial where characters speak to us and tell us to do things and all of that kind of stuff. Little notes that pop up. I guess this is similar to a tooltip, but this is a little bit more contextual. We've got the classic like diagrams on the wall thing. Like, I'm making a little platformer prototype at the moment, and I've already decided that this will be the approach I take before people playtest it. And the thing I really like about this approach, I think the kind of instructions in the game world thing is a really good thing to do as a first pass on a tutorial. Even if it doesn't fit the mood of your game, to kind of do the quickest thing possible to get in front of playtesters, you might be better off just putting some diagrams in the game rather than like having to structure a whole tutorial where characters speak to you and stuff like that. So I'm going down that route because it's a kind of tried and tested thing in platformers, but there are other genres where this could make sense, right? It might not tonally fit your game, but while you're just initially working out if people like the game and playtesting it with people, it's a good kind of gap filler, I guess. Just slap the tutorial on the floor, on the wall, whatever, and then kind of make a more sophisticated approach later on. And then over here is perhaps one of the most important teaching tools that we have in games. If I sidle over, it's dying. So, you know, talked about Dark Souls already. Dark Souls kills you pretty early on, in a very unfair way as well. Like, it just kind of puts you up against a boss that is just not something you can't beat when you've just started the game. And that teaches you something about the game. It doesn't necessarily teach you how to win in that situation, but it teaches you this is what this game is going to be like. Mario, very similar. You will die in your first 30 seconds of playing Mario. And there's no text, there's nothing that comes up and says, hey, don't do that next time. You just sort of get the interrupt. The music stops. You get the kind of disappointing music for when you die, the sound effect and all of that kind of thing. And this kind of creates a scenario where you're like, well, I want to avoid that happening. But it also doesn't like punish you too much. It just takes you back to the start of the level in that case, unless you've lost all your lives. So one of the things I would encourage you to think about, if your game has death in it and it has like very if your game has very frequent death in it, like in a survivors type game or something like that, make sure that your death feels like a little bit of an interruption and that it has a sort of not celebratory quality to it, but it at least feels like something happened. You know, have a special sound effect for it, have some special moment for when you die so that it feels meaningful before you start the game up again. And I know there are certain types of games like speedrunning games where you want to just restart as quickly as possible. I'm not necessarily talking about those and that situation, but death should kind of feel like something that the player can sort of have a little bit of a celebration about, and it's sort of something about it that is kind of very clear what's happening, and it's not just like the game stops. Right? The game needs to do something in acknowledgement of you dying, and that's part of the death as a teaching tool thing, really. And yeah, I've talked about this a little bit already, but when you've done all this already, when you've done all of the kind of stages here, and you've made sure that your game is as self-explanatory as it can be before you start thinking about a real tutorial, then your real tutorial needs to not just tell people what to do or why to do it. And sometimes telling them why to do it is not great because working that out on your own is fun. It depends on the kind of style of the game. But you want to onboard them into the setting and the tone of the game as well. And Portal 2 does this in a fantastic way. I don't know how many of you have played Portal 2, but we get Wheatley, the robot here, and it comes up with an instruction to say apple. And then Wheatley keeps saying speak, say apple. And you press the button that you're being told is speak, and your character jumps in the air. Right? So this is doing like some very strange stuff with our expectations of how tutorials usually work. It gives us the incorrect information in the HUD about what the button does, and that creates a really good moment of delight that kind of teaches you that that's the jump button, even though it says it was going to be the speak button. And that onboards you into like not just how the controls work, but also the general tone of the game, because the kind of sense of humor in Portal is quite antagonistic to the player. It's quite cruel in some ways, and that is a brilliant way to teach the controls and onboard the player into the kind of world and the tone of the world at the same time. And then the other one that the other skill you just have to learn in order to do this a lot of the time is going to be learning how to edit text down until there's less and less and less and less and less, but it still means the same thing. So I'll put this here to be ironic, you know. Woe betide those who write phrases too circuitous for their meaning to be grasped quickly and without laborious effort. Right? That's not a good way to write tutorial text. Most of the time, and this is going to be different if you're going down the kind of, if you're putting a tutorial in a story-heavy game like Portal, then you're going to be trying to merge how to play the game with setting and tone and world. But a lot of the time, you want to just give people a very clear instruction. Do this. Right? Learn how to edit copy. That's a just direct instruction. This isn't even in instruction. It says, woe betide those who blah, 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 blah. It doesn't even tell us why we should do it. It just says it's bad to write long-winded things. Right? So one of the things that we'll see come up a lot of times when we're kind of playtesting games and people have made their first tutorial, it's just like, are there 3 sentences here when there could be 2? Are there 2 sentences when there could be 1? Right? Are you kind of hiding the meaning of what you're trying to say here by just putting too many words on the screen? Right? Like, go and pick up the gun. Guns are used to shoot people. Shooting people is helpful because if they're trying to kill you, you need to kill them first. Right? There's so much in that doesn't need to be there because players know a lot of that information already. And you don't want them to nope out of your game straight away because they're doing the old Johnny Silverhand. I'm happy for you though, or sorry that happened. So these are just some screenshots from a game in our community that is very, very fun to play, but I know over the last couple of weeks the developer has been back and forth on tutorial design quite a bit. And this text isn't from their tutorial. This text is me putting like an example of a bad and good tutorialization on top, right? So in this situation, if the tutorial is telling me to pick up a gun, then all I really need to know is what button I press to get the gun, right? I'm being told to get the gun. I'm being told what button to press in order to do it. And particularly because this is an action game where I'm under threat of fire and stuff like that, the less words or the fewer words you can put on the screen at once, the better. Both for my understanding, my ability to pass the information, and for kind of fitting into the mindset of what the game is, which is about like looking at the situation that's in the world, in the kind of diegesis of the game world, and not worrying too much about anything layered on top. So we don't need to say, if you stand next to a gun and press X, you can pick it up, right? We'll just say X, get gun. And most people, the vast majority of people, will understand that if the gun is over here on the floor and my character's over here, then pressing X isn't going to like make the gun teleport to me, that I'll need to move to it, right? Picking up a gun puts it in your inventory. You can use a gun to shoot enemies, right? And those are examples of redundant information because the player would know that already. And the other thing is to think about, and you'll see this a lot in AAA games, just anytime you can put contextual information in about what to press in the situation, if you can just bake that in so it's always there rather than part of the tutorial, again, coming back to that earlier idea of like, what persistent reminders does your game have in about how to play it? If you could just put the controls in the interaction itself, then this no longer has to be part of a tutorial segment of a game. It can just be information that's always available, right? So, as I said, I'm going to put these little checkpoints in just so I can dip into the chat and see what's been asked so far, so that we don't break the flow too much. Sergey is sort of summarizing, reasonable tutorial can only be added when the rest of the game's taken enough shape, sure, but is it important to build your game in a way that would make adding tutorial not too hard? Asking yourself, can tutorial be made as another mission map later is the point. Yeah, so I think there are a bunch of different approaches, but if your game has a lot of unlocks, right, which I think most people do this when they set out to make a game now, they have abilities to unlock, characters and stuff like that, then the shape of your game should really be about like learning to use those different things at the point at which you unlock them, right? So if you've got a game with 12 levels, presumably the player character is not going to be the same through those 12 levels. So you're now starting to think about the interaction between like the design of mechanics and systems and the design of level content. And yeah, I mean, designing the early levels of a game to give players a first-time user experience that onboards them into the game is often a case of, you know, with the Mario example, which I'll show in a minute, taking as much of the game away as possible and just adding it in gradually so that by the time they get to like level 3 or 4, they sort of understand all the basic stuff. Apparent Main said, do you prefer that you use all the available teaching tools, or is it better to stick with one for consistency? So I think there's a couple of different questions there, really. And like, one is that as a developer, any of these things you use, any of these devices that you use to tutorialize and explain your game, is going to cost you time and effort, isn't it? So you want to use the things that are cheaper for you to do to start off with, which is why I said when you're in early prototyping, you know, use the sign on the wall method rather than the loads of story dialogue method, you know? I think, yeah, being consistent makes a lot of sense. But again, it kind of depends on what sort of game that you're talking about. And like tooltips work very well for turn-based games because you can take your time to look around them. So games like Civilization, 4X games, any sorts of card games, they all have tooltips all over the place because they are slow games where everything is happening in the game interface rather than in the world. In an action game, you might have to do a little bit more of this. You might have to do a little bit more like we're going to show you a situation, and if you don't learn to do what you're supposed to learn to do in this scene, you're going to die, right? And then you loop back to the start of the scene if the player dies, right? And you just string together lots of those scenes, and hopefully by the end of that sequence, the player is going to know all the basic things that they need to do to survive in that game. So I don't think it's really a matter of like counting the things and saying you should only have one teaching tool in your game, or you should have 5. It's really about judging what sort of game you're making, and sort of understanding like what's the best way to teach that thing. And some of it will come down to audience, because if your game is very clearly trying to be a sort of adrenaline pumping high action game, then your audience's tolerance for reading things is going to go down considerably as well. So I found a really nice set of sort of UX guidelines for designing tutorials in educational games of all places. This is from BBC Gel, which is like when BBC makes media, they have like UX guidelines across the entirety of the BBC, like the national, the global stuff, and everything as well. And I found this list, and we're going to just go through some examples of stuff from this list, because I thought even though this is an educational games thing, it's actually a really good sort of set of guidelines for any sort of game. So the first one is that the onboarding is part of the game, right? It's not a separate thing that happens that in its own level, and it can be, but even then, like if you think of like big AAA games you've played where there's a discrete tutorial level, there's that. And then there is still like this gradual onboarding into mechanics. Like, I don't know, there's a thing where you get to drive a ship, and we don't do that until level 5 because it's quite complicated. So even just like holding back game mechanics and scenarios until later in the game when the player knows how to do the basic stuff, that is part of onboarding design, right? Keeping more complex and like fiddly, difficult to control mechanics out of the first time user experience, so that the first time user experience is just teaching the basics of the game, getting the player onboarded and excited about the general premise of the game and the tone of the world and all of that kind of stuff. That's what we mean when we say that onboarding is part of the game. It's not this separate little bit that happens at the beginning. The second one, keep to the essentials, don't overtell. We've already touched on this a little bit, where I was talking about just, if you want people to pick up the gun, highlight the gun, say get the gun. Don't tell them why they need to do it. Don't, you're giving an instruction, you're not giving an explanation, all of that kind of stuff. Third one, introduce at the moment of need. Don't tell me why I need to do something like 10 minutes before it happens, all of that kind of stuff. We're going to go through these in more detail in a moment. I'm just kind of breaking them down top level to start off with. Teaching through play should be self-evident, but if you need to put up a big screen that says, if you do this, then this will happen, and if you do this, then this will happen, then that sort of implies to me that your game doesn't teach itself very well, because actually what you need to be able to do is say, this is how you do action A, this is how you do action B, this is how you do action C, and then the player does those actions and then just sees what happens when they kind of play out in different ways. And they go, oh, if I only do action A and I don't do action B, then I die. If I only do action B and I whatever. An example of that would be like a deck builder. If I only play attack cards and I never play defense cards, I die. If I only play defense cards and I never play attack cards, I don't win. So you can learn the general structure of the game by being told these basic units of interaction and then stringing them together yourself. You don't want to have loads and loads of text saying, if you do A and B, then this will happen, but if you do B and C, then this will happen, because it's just too much front loading, and people want to experience it for themselves and learn it for themselves, which we'll go into in more detail in a little bit. Don't teach everything. There are some good reasons behind this, and understanding your players, which I kind of, again, talked about a little bit in relation to, tolerance for different amounts of text and different approaches like that as well. Jobo in the chat said, I feel like the more abstracted the mechanics or system of the game is, the more tutorialization you will generally need to do. Yeah, exactly. And we're going to get into this in a little while of like, you don't need to teach someone every part of how to play a video game, right? You need to understand what makes your video game unusual and which parts of it people are going to need to learn because they're different from other games, that kind of thing. But to give a good example of the onboarding is part of the game thing, you probably would have heard this story about the original Mario, but these guys over here, you just go down here, so I'm hanging out with them. These guys over here, the Goombas, they didn't exist for a very long time in the total sort of life cycle of Mario being made. We had the Koopas, the Koopa Troopers, the turtles that you jump on. But those, you kind of jump on them, they leave a shell, and if you jump on the shell starts bouncing around and becomes a weapon that can hurt enemies or you can run into and pick up the shell and you can launch it, right? That is quite a sort of complex set of mechanics, the way that the turtles work in Mario. And if you think of that as a kind of like a cognitive cost of being able to play and enjoy a part of Mario with that in. So they developed these Goombas later on, these sort of evil looking mushroom guys that you just jump on their head and they're gone. And they weren't developed until much later in the life cycle of the game. And then they were put at the beginning of the game to teach you that that is generally how you deal with enemies, right? So again, we're coming back to the link between designing your content, like your levels, your encounters, all of that kind of stuff, to gradually teach the things that you need to learn about the game. And in this case, it's just doing it through, if you do it right, you finish the level, and if you don't do it right, you die, right? The most basic way of teaching a game that exists is just success or failure. But even in this kind of situation, we don't want it to be too harsh, so we want to teach one thing at a time. And the thing we want to teach is, if an enemy just walks into you, you die. If you jump on the enemy's head, they die, right? So the Goombas exist to teach this lesson. And in this situation, we can also kind of learn that if we jump up and hit one of these blocks, we break the block, and we can combine those mechanics and we can break a block and then land on the Goomba and feel like we've done sort of like some kind of trick shot, right? So that is onboarding us into the general pleasure of a platformer and the way that you can kind of perform these moves in a different way each time and get a slightly different outcome, right? So there's a lot being onboarded here. And again, the other thing with Mario is that the first world, which we're seeing a screenshot of here, was developed at the end, right? So it's not just even the case that what I said earlier, don't develop your tutorial prematurely, but maybe the first couple of levels of your game should be developed later on, like at the end. Once you know what the game really is and you know what things people need to learn in order to do the game, your game is really the middle of itself, if that makes sense. So to explain that more clearly is like your game, the heart of your game is what happens in the middle of the game. That is the point at which your player understands the game, and they understand it as well as you do as the designer of the game, or maybe even better than you do, right? We've definitely experienced this. And that is where the real game is. So everything that comes before that is kind of teaching the player to get them up to speed so that when they get to the kind of middle of the game, the second act, whatever you want to call it, then they can really engage with what the game is meant to be. And that is one of the reasons why, the Mario example gets used to teach this quite a lot. You may just need to come back to the game at the end and kind of build early levels that are really easy, seem way too easy by your standard, that onboard players into the way of thinking that they're supposed to have in order to play the game. And it may be something as simple as like, here are some basic jumps. If you die, you die. And the game is going to kind of show you what you need to do to succeed with as little kind of text or anything as possible. It might actually be that you've gone down the portal route and you have a story introduction and all of that. And the story introduction incorporates some degree of tutorialization in some way. But you're not going to have a good sense of what that needs to be until you've seen people play your game a lot and you know what they need to learn. So one of the principles on that list was to introduce things at the moment of need, right? So putting contextual tutorials in a level might seem like a kind of cheesy way of doing things, but I still think this is a very good quick hack for most people who are testing out the early stages of a prototype. You know, if you don't really know if your design has legs yet, I wouldn't go to all the effort of building a proper tutorial when you can just slap some instructions on the walls and stuff like that. And depending on the type of game, this might actually suffice and be a good enough thing to kind of keep in the game for the whole way. But when it comes to like building your kind of final version of your tutorial, you should probably think of your tutorial as a system which runs through the whole game rather than a section of content at the beginning. Some games will be fine with a section of content at the beginning, but like I said, you have helper mechanics like text pop-ups, like in-world tutorial, all of this kind of stuff can be very, very helpful for lapsed players. And some of this is going to really depend on just you understanding what type of game you're making, right? If you make a very linear story-based experience that takes 3 or 4 hours, then that is less likely to be the sort of game that people put down for a long period of time and then pick up and get confused by, right? Whereas if you're making a Slay the Spire or something like that, your game needs to be able to kind of re-explain itself when players come back in and they're lapsed. So think about when people need to know things. When they first start playing the game, they need to know, like, why am I here? What buttons do I press to do the basic interactions? But later on in the game, they're still going to maybe need to know what the frozen keyword means or what the death rattle keyword means and stuff like that. So it's not enough to just stick it all at the beginning. And then the other trick that I really like, that has been in games since I was just a wee lad, right? This is Dungeon Keeper, which is a very funny game, is that you can hide some of the complexity in your game and introduce it later on, as we've already talked about. But the clever thing is you present that as a reward. You don't present it as like, hey, you're stupid, so in the first level of this city builder, you only get to build 3 things because you're a dumbass, right? You present those things as just like, this is what we do in the first town, and then when you go to the next town, I was like, oh, well, you've unlocked these things now, right? And the player is going to feel like that's a progression reward that they've earned by doing something good. But actually what it's achieving is stopping them from being overloaded with stuff that they can do and stuff that they have to understand and think about. This has been a thing in Sims and management games for a very long time. All of the Bullfrog games had this, Dungeon Keeper had this, Theme Park had this, and actually one of the areas where I think this genre of games has suffered a lot since we got like Steam Early Access and stuff like that, is developers tend to just build the sandbox version of the game. I had an experience of this with Prison Architect that I should have put on here, where it was just the early access version of the game for years and years and years was a sandbox, and it didn't have any of this structuring where it was like, on level 1, we will learn how to build these things and control these systems. And then on level 2, we will have these 2 things added to our inventory of stuff we can do and this additional problem to solve. And then on level 3, we will learn about these things, right? And then, Slay the Spire does this as well, and could actually be one of the reasons why some people don't get on with Slay the Spire, is it sort of hides some of the deck building options early on, and maybe to its detriment in some ways. I've just kind of started playing it again on a new save, and I keep going, hey, where's that card? And it's because I haven't unlocked it yet, right? But what they're doing is they're preventing you from breaking your build and having too much of a bad experience early on by hiding the more complex stuff, right? The stuff that has worse consequences, right? So I would encourage people to think about what unlocks are for in your games. And when you're making a game that has stuff to unlock, like abilities, characters, all of this kind of stuff, when we come at it with our gamer brain, we're like, it's cool to unlock stuff. That's a reward, right? This is nice to get stuff. And we kind of just finish it there, don't think any more about it. But actually what you tend to be doing with development is hiding the more complex mechanics in the things you unlock later on, right? So I played a hack and slash on here a few months ago called Power Champions. Played as the first character, unlocked the second character, and the second character was a tank. And it was a really bad unlock because I'd gone from a more complex to a less complex character. And the tank didn't really have any interesting utility to me at that point, because the purpose of a tank in a single player game is just, oh, you can make more mistakes because you can take more damage, right? You can't deal the damage out. It's a lower risk, lower reward type of character. So in that situation, I would have structured it so the tank was the first character, because you can use them when you're not very good at the game. And then you unlock the second character and you get some more complexity. You get a different challenge, right? FTL does this with its spaceships as well. You finish the game, you unlock another spaceship, and the other spaceships are like different modes of playing the game. And some of them are more like, they're a bit of a glass cannon. They make the game more difficult in particular ways. And often as players, we see this as just a reward of like, oh, I got a new thing, I unlocked some variety. But what is actually happening in terms of the like big structural game design of the thing is that we are hiding complexity away until you're ready for it, right? So this is kind of still onboarding in a way. I mean, it's maybe a bit of a stretch to call that onboarding, but we can have these decisions about what happens 12 hours into a game or 20 hours into a game that are like just about hiding something until it's time for the player to engage with it. Another little reminder of something I know we've talked about before on the channel is cognitive load and how many pieces of information a person can have in their head at once in their short-term memory. So we talked about this last month's live lecture when we were talking about interface design. And the idea there is that you kind of want to limit how many things are on the screen at one time in terms of like things that are giving the player information. But then people kind of tend to chunk things up and see them as one thing as well. So if you imagine like an inventory bar in Minecraft at the bottom that says which items you've got, most people take that in as one piece of information. It's like, I have an inventory, and if I want to know what's in it, I can look at it and see. But in terms of like the overall screen and whether I kind of perceive it as overwhelming, that is just one item, right? And generally speaking, you have this concept in cognitive theory, and this goes back to 1956, so it's been debated and somewhat disproven since then, but it's still something that's used a lot in UX design, is this idea of the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. And the magical number 7 plus or minus 2 is like the number of things that most people can hold in their short-term memory. So 7 is like the sweet spot. 9 is people with a very strong short-term memory. Beyond that is people with a exceptionally strong short-term memory, and then down to 5 is kind of most people can do it, right? And what that really means is that if someone gives you a string of 7 numbers, you're going to struggle to kind of remember it and internalize it. But what we tend to do over time with something like a telephone number is we chunk those pieces of information and then remember them as separate things, right? So I know my area calling code, not as a sequence of numbers, but almost like this block of sound, and I can just say it, right, without thinking about the numbers. It's the same with like passwords on phones and stuff. I sort of know it as a shape that my hand moves in rather than a string of numbers. The longer we use a piece of information, the more we tend to chunk it up, and then we can recall it as one thing rather than the set of things that make it up. So generally speaking, and this is just something that can apply at any stage of a tutorial or teaching people your game, but you want to minimize the amount of things they can perceive at any given time. And that means that instead of being over here and really pushing it, right, this yellow and orange section is you are pushing it in terms of how much you're expecting your player to look at and think about and take in. This is the section that we can be in when a player has already been onboarded into the game and understands the core of the game, and we can start to test them a little bit. But when they're learning, we want to be more down here. We want to say like, okay, do this now, right? And we're just giving them one instruction, and maybe there's one or two other things on the screen, and we're limiting the amount of stuff that we're telling players to do. And then we can gradually go up here to kind of have more complexity and more stuff on the screen. So the reason why a lot of people don't implement this properly is because of, well, like, it takes time as a as a kind of development thing. And I think deep down, you know, when someone's learning your game, you want to keep things simple. You want to keep them on this end of the spectrum. But in order to do that, you have to have done this thing, which is like thinking of the tutorial as a system that runs through your game. So do you have the tech in your game engine or your game to be able to like hide certain things under certain situations? Because if we're following this cognitive load theory and we're trying to keep our tutorial to like having the least amount of things on the screen and giving one instruction at a time, then we might want to do things like, okay, at this point we hide all of those buttons, we hide the inventory button, we hide the health bar, because none of that is relevant now, and we just show what is relevant, right? Those kind of things in a lot of games are the things that need to happen to keep the cognitive load of the tutorial down this end. But in order to achieve that, you need to have whatever technical stuff required in your game to be able to quickly turn things on and off at different stages of your tutorial, right? Which is kind of why I'm saying don't spend too much time trying to make a proper tutorial in the early stages of your game, because a proper tutorial looks like this. A proper tutorial looks like we are stripping the game back to just what the player needs to learn at this moment in time, and we're hiding all this interface and we're hiding this interface so that they can kind of concentrate on the thing that they need to learn at this moment. And in order to do that, you need to create loads of exceptions to your game rules. And when you're in the early stages of prototyping and feasibility testing, you don't know if it's worth doing that yet. So you may as well just stick a thing on the wall that says shoot enemies and take their money or whatever, you know? Just going to dip back into the chat now. Questions or comments in the chat? Sergey said, preferred approach to tutorial missions is how it's done in Hearthstone or Plants vs. Zombies, which is let the game be played, but in a simplified set of missions, introducing mechanics slowly. Yeah, and like Plants vs. Zombies and Hearthstone are both examples of games where you get a lot of variation out of content, and it kind of has to be the case, because in Hearthstone it's like you can play 7 units and you can cast spells, and that's all you can do. So all the variation in the game comes from what those units are and what those spells are. Plants vs. Zombies, same thing. Different enemies, different plants you can plant, and occasionally different garden layouts, but the kind of situational stuff at the board doesn't change that much. So that means that you can do exactly what Sergey's saying, which is, you know, structure your game to be just like the simplest set of mechanics for the first level. The second level, we introduce mechanic A. The third level, we introduce mechanic B. The fourth level, we do A and B at the same time, and maybe we introduce C at the end as a boss or something like that. This is just general good structure for a game. Now, depending on who the audience for your game is, you can maybe accelerate or decelerate that, and you can say, well, this is like a hardcore game. You know, if you're making an indie Souls-like, and you know your fan base are people that have played every single Souls game, then you can maybe be a bit more forgiving with it, or a bit less lenient with this stuff, and kind of accelerate it. But generally speaking, that is kind of the best approach to this. And again, that is not necessarily building a tutorial in the sense of like things interrupt you, things pop up, things tell you what to do. It is just structuring the delivery of the content of the game so that you are able to learn as much of it for yourself rather than be told by a pop-up or anything how to do it better. Hi, Death Girl. Death Girl asked how long has the stream been going? About 45 minutes, I think. But the VOD will be up afterwards as well, so you can watch it all the way through. Jobo said, I'm thinking of when I get a new character at the late in a JRPG and how I'll often get 10 to 20 new abilities at once. Not overwhelmed with that, but used to it. Yeah, it's kind of like when you respec a character, right? And you've got like a skill tree. And your first time through the skill tree, you've done it unit by unit. And that's kind of how skill trees work. They take a massive system with all of these different possibilities in. And every time you put a point in, you're only picking between certain points, right? I talked about this when I played Aramis's Hexagod a few weeks ago. I said, because he'd gone for like a skill tree where you can go in 6 directions from the start. It sort of gives you quite a lot of leeway for things to think about and potentially choose a suboptimal path. But most of the time, skill trees, it's like 3 things to start with, and then you get more and more options as you go out. And then if you reset your character and you get your points back, now it's like, well, I can think through the entire skill tree at once to try and get to that particular point. At which point you're well kind of enmeshed in the game mechanics to be able to navigate that and maybe even find it a fun thing to do, you know? Yeah, Jill said don't take any don't take too many assumptions about what players have played before and how it's kind of delivered in that game. I think that can be really helpful. Uh, Kuro said, what's your opinion on not directly teaching the player but being lenient with the punishment for failing early on or even allowing them to fail forward for a while? Again, this is going to depend on, like, again, we're tutorializing the game so that the player understands the mechanics, but we're also onboarding the player into the game, right? Which means what type of fun is the player supposed to be having in this game? And does our tutorial and onboarding push them in the direction of that type of fun, right? So the Portal example of telling players to speak and then they press the jump button is funny, and it tells us that the game is going to be cruel, right? The way we get whomped by a boss immediately in Elden Ring tells us the game is going to be cruel. It's onboarding us into the tone and like emotional, the type of fun that the game is about, right? So I think you can totally be lenient with punishment for failing early on, but you need to think about like what type of game is this and who is it for and why do I want to be lenient with them, right? It may be that you are making a game specifically for children, right? The Lego sort of, what's the TT something Tales game that makes the company that makes all the Lego games, they're incredibly lenient, right? So that's a situation where they're thinking about the audience, they're thinking about who the audience is, and then being lenient for a reason. But I think you need to be true to what your game is about, and don't fall too much into the kind of idea of like, oh, the customer is always right. I don't want angry Steam reviews, so I'll make sure this thing is too easy, right? If you're making a game that is about punishing difficulty, then maybe the onboarding should still contain that punishing difficulty, but maybe in a way that's easy to sort of digest and get past, right? And again, a lot of this stuff is not tutorialization. This is down to playtesting and seeing what happens when people interact with the game. Because if people play your game like 5 times and they're initially saying, oh, this is too hard, but then they get better and they overcome that, then that's a good sign that it's not actually too hard. They just have an initially frustrating experience. They push through it, they learn something, and then they continue with the game, right? If your game is too hard at the beginning because it's overwhelming, there's too much information, there's too many different things to think about, that's the sort of thing where it might be a kind of content structure problem where you need to put some simpler stuff in first. Difficulty spike after 2 hours, yeah. Inbuilt timer. Know when people cross the 2 hours thing for when people can't refund the game anymore, and then just send in a boss from Dark Souls into your visual novel or your casual puzzle game and kill everyone. Yeah, that's great. In a roguelike, does it mean you should limit the builds to the easiest ones first? Well, I mean, if it's a traditional roguelike, you don't limit anything, because in a traditional roguelike, every run has the potential for you to finish the game or do all the stuff, right? It just, again, it really depends on the tone of your game. If you look at Hades, right? Hades was going for a wider audience than traditional, or not traditional, but action roguelites generally did. They wanted it to be more accessible. So they did certain design choices, right? They made you carry more stuff over. It becomes more a game of grinding and gradually getting a more powerful character. These are decisions that are based on what does the team want to make, who is it for, all of these kind of things. So I think if you've got questions about like that sort of thing, what should I do in my game? I think you just need to kind of come up with who it's for. It's either for you, right, which is the easiest persona to design for because you know what your own tastes are, and you can start from there. Or you can start with something a bit more, a bit more grand. So Plants vs Zombies, for example, was George Fan going, I love tower defense games. I love how they're like a distillation of certain parts of RTS. I really like tower defense games, but what if I tried to make a tower defense game that my mum could understand and play? And that's really the kind of design philosophy behind Plants vs Zombies. Is taking yeah, exactly. Okay, so Novice said that your game is for your dad who is 65. Excellent. Your dad who is 65 and likes setting fire to an assortment of animals using spells. That's just what he's into, Everyone needs a hobby. But that will guide you, right? That will give you a sense of where your design decisions should point, because you can say, well, actually, it's okay if my game is a bit horrible to people because I've made it clear from the start that that's what they're getting into, right? And this is one of those areas where your game design and your creative direction really come together, because like if you look at Balatro, there's not much character or story in Balatro, but the whole thing of this kind of sneering jester tells you something about how the game is going to treat you, right? How you're going to feel when you play this game. And the Portal example is like that. And there are definitely games that subvert this, where we have a cute looking game and then it turns out to be horrible to us in some way. But generally speaking, people see the kind of creative direction of a game and they expect the difficulty and the way the game teaches itself to line up with that in some way. It's one of the reasons why people talk about Nintendo hardcore as a thing, because that's kind of the exception that proves the rule, right? It's very unusual to get a game that looks like Zelda and is as hard as Zelda. But that's kind of what Nintendo hardcore is. It's like cute games that play like hardcore games. And generally, in the kind of course of history of all of video games, we've got used to associating like dark, edgy aesthetics with difficulty and kind of punishing game mechanics, because that's what generally happens. But Nintendo hardcore sort of falls outside of that. Jobo said your player is building a mental model of the game over time. Some of that is up to legibility rather than explicit tutorialization per se. Yeah, exactly. This is what I'm trying to get across. Some of it is just if you do an explicit tutorial and you tell the player 3 things at once, that's just not the ideal way for them to take in that information, right? You can tell them the things one at a time, or you can tell just one thing and let them discover thing 3 on their own, because actually that's not important for them to get onboarded and explore the game and understand it. And I have some silly examples of that coming up later on as well. It's exactly this type of thing, actually. So from the BBC Jail checklist, teach through play and don't teach everything, right? When you structure learning activities as an educator, you have a style of teaching called didactic, which is like telling people stuff, talking at them. And then there's a spectrum of different types of teaching and learning you can do. And right at the other side, you've got discovery-based learning. And if you've ever been into a classroom and the tutor or lecturer didn't tell you what you were learning at the beginning of that session, you were probably doing some kind of discovery-based learning. So discovery-based learning is like you do an activity and then at the end you reflect on what you personally learned. And the thing that is good about discovery-based learning is you can use it with groups where like people are at very different stages of their development. And they can all learn different things depending on what they're doing. It's one of the reasons why Indies Under the Knife is structured the way it is. And I don't just do stuff where we just say, this applies to all video games, because that is mostly nonsense for people learning game development. You have every single person who's in this chat now is at a different stage of what they're doing. They've got different experiences of making different genres and stuff like that. So when you engage with like a learning activity, you are going to get different things out of it. So it's much better to have like opportunities to just sort of explore and kind of interrogate things yourself than to just be told things, because you're all kind of way past the point of just being told kind of quote unquote facts about stuff, right? Which is again why these lectures are in this format. It's a series of things to think about. It's not necessarily facts that you must learn in order to do the thing good. But this is a really good example of teach through play. This goes way back to things like Metroid and stuff like that as well. We have an explosive thing. We have a big hammer or something like that. We can see structural weaknesses in the world. I wonder what happens if we put these two things together. And because we're smart, even as little kids, we can see that a game has artifice and is made by people and has intention behind it. You kind of read into these things like a crack in the wall, and you go, well, that's probably been put there for a reason. Whoever made this game down in the video game minds probably had some intentionality behind putting this on the wall. So I'm gonna, what's the thing I can do that most seems like it's going to interact with a crack in the wall? Okay, some sort of explosive is going to break that, you know. Hotwell's also. I'll come back to that quote because that's that comment, because I think that's quite helpful. It's important to put stuff to exercise every skill you've taught through the whole game, so players don't forget. Yeah, I had this experience with Time Cowboy the other day, where we had 3 attacks. We had punching, pistol, shotgun, and I forgot that punching would heal your character, which is quite a funny mechanic, but difficult to learn because it's not very intuitive. And the problem I experienced is I after I'd first learned to use the punching, I then always had a gun, and there was no reason to go back to the punching, so I forgot that was how you healed, right? So I needed the game to just sort of maybe force me in some way to go back to the punching more times, so that I could secure in my brain that is what the punching was for. You know, it's not just for doing damage up close, it's actually got a secondary function of healing you. And that was a cool mechanic, but the way that the game was structured, because when I died, I didn't lose my guns. I was never required to use the punch again. So, yeah, some of it is about cycling through things enough times for people to learn them. You know, like you build a structure for a game that's almost like a song. So we do A, B, C, then we do A, B, C, D, then we do B, C, D, then we do A, B, C. And this is the kind of stuff that when people are designing long games, they will put it in a spreadsheet. You need to repeat certain things and go back over them. In this sort of like spiral fashion, going past the same things multiple times. Because if you just tell people something once, get them to do it once, the knowledge of how to do that thing isn't going to be secure, you know? Although, I don't have any kind of neurocognitive thing to back this up, but I would suggest that moments like this, where the player works something out for themselves, are much more likely to kind of go in and stay in, rather than the moments when they're told to do something. I think this was meant to be with the earlier stuff on cognitive load. Yeah, so we talked about cognitive load. We talked a little bit about chunking already, right? As you do a set of things more frequently, it becomes like it becomes a single concept, right? So if you think of a combat game, when you're first playing the game, you are aiming, shooting, dodging, picking up whatever's dropped, and you're thinking about these all as separate things. And then the more you do that set of activities, the more it becomes a chunk. And then your idea of like going and clearing out a room becomes one thing, right? So you go from being overwhelmed by all of these different separate things you have to do, which is quite, you know, sometimes when I say being overwhelmed can be nice sometimes when you're just right on the edge of it, right? That's kind of what we get out of like bullet hell games and stuff. Oh my God, what's going on? But eventually that kind of gets compressed down into like one thing that you can think of. And then the game could be in danger of being too easy at that point. So I've also got some quotes here from Josh Beiser, who's been running this game design site, Game Wisdom, for a very long time now. and just a couple of things that I feel like we've already touched upon, but they bear repeating. The first one, this kind of comes from he's got an article on Medium, The Struggles of Onboarding Gamers, and then a YouTube video that goes along with it. When we finish the stream and the VOD goes out, I will put links to all of these things in the VOD description. I didn't put them in prematurely because I was still working on these notes up until yesterday. But the key thing, and I feel like someone in the chat already mentioned this earlier, is you need to understand what about your game is unique, right? And things which don't exist in every game in the genre. You probably, if there's a standard thing in the genre, like click on a character to select them, right click to make them move, whatever that thing is that you've taken from other games, you probably do still need to tell people how to do that, right? And this is where contextual tooltips and stuff like that come in. But the thing you need to spend more time on explaining, or even better, showing the players how it works, is going to be whatever is unique about your game, whatever is the thing that makes it stand out in its genre. And the other thing here, which kind of relates back to what we were just talking about, remember that some of it you need to leave for them to find out for themselves, because that is part of the fun. So learning that you can blow holes in walls in Zelda is a fun thing to learn on your own. And it's something that doesn't happen immediately in the game. And that kind of feeling of walking past something a bunch of times and then picking up a new tool and going, hang on, that tool interacts with that thing that I've seen a bunch of times, putting it together in your own head, going testing your own theory as a player and seeing that it pays off. Really, really satisfying. You don't want to deny players of that satisfaction by going, oh, well, there's 1 in 20 players that doesn't get this, so we need to sort of tutorialize it. That would generally be a loss for your game. Another example of this would be strategies. So something like building a busted combo in a deck builder, you don't want to tell players how to do that, right? You want to give them all the tools to be able to do it, and then let them kind of learn over time that they can do that. And you could feed them little bits of clues about that, like loading screen tips and all of that kind of stuff. But you need to understand that teaching the thing needs to not take away the inherent pleasure of the thing, right? You're teaching what the player needs to know so they can access the fun in your game. And that process of teaching them needs to not take the fun away. And this is like a big part of Raf Costa's theory of fun for game design, is that you know, what we experience as having fun is like an evolutionary thing that humans have in order to force them to learn, right? We experience curiosity about things, and we want to investigate them and find out how they work. And this is all driven by our dopamine system, and sort of learning things by engaging with them and experimenting them and testing how they work is just a fundamental thing about humans and how we learn. And we have this kind of trick in our bodies that rewards us for doing that, and that's why we are the type of animals we are. Right? So again, thinking about what we just spoke about, your tutorial needs to, and thinking about learning styles and types of teaching that I spoke about a minute ago, your tutorial should be as didactic as it needs to be, right? Limited telling, not loads of telling, and the telling that does happen maybe shouldn't explain too much, right? Again, get the gun, shoot the guy, right? Just short directions that tell you what to do next or tell you how to use a control, but which do not over-explain why you should be doing things or how if you do A, B, and C, then D will happen. Because that's the stuff that the players should learn by experiencing it, not by being told too much. You do need to hack the brain, Seamus. Yeah, that's what we're here to do. That's what game design is. We're all brain hackers. That's what game design is. That's what UX is. We are hacking the human brain. And that's just stuff about dopamine that I don't have enough dopamine to pay attention to. But dopamine is regulating your ability to pay attention to things. Your reward and motivation stuff in your brain is all linked to it. Your formation of memories is linked to it. Go and do some reading about it in your own spare time. I know a lot of us just kind of talk about it in kind of a giggly, jokey sense of like, oh, I need dopamine, I'll go on TikTok. But it is really bound up with what are we experiencing at a kind of neuropsychological level when we are having fun with something. And a good game tutorial in most cases should be not just telling you a bunch of stuff, but onboarding you into the fun of the game, right? If the fun of your game is about solving puzzles and working things out for yourself, then the tutorial needs to not detract from that too much. The tutorial needs to not onboard you into a way of thinking that isn't representative of the type of fun in the game. And the other thing that Costa gets into a lot in this book is that, people have different things they find fun. There are some people who will never play a puzzle game. There are some people who will never play a shooter. They are games about learning to solve different sorts of problems. And again, I've been talking a lot about onboarding, and your onboarding for your game needs to be honest about what the game is, right? Just like your marketing for the game needs to be honest about what the game is. It's better to have 1,000 people playing your game who are the right people to play that game because the marketing was truthful, the tutorial, the first time user experience were truthful, you funneled the correct people into your game, and you didn't mislead people. And sometimes when I say mislead, I don't mean you're being Machiavellian or something, but sometimes people are just very bad at marketing, very bad at tutorializing things, and that leads people to think their game is going to be something other than what it is, right? And before I play your game, I should know what it is. And as I play the first hour of your game, that should be representative of what your game is. So there's all these different stages of onboarding, from seeing a Steam page to playing the first hour of a game. And all of those things should lead us towards the type of fun that the game is offering, and not something else. Unless you're making Inscription or Pony Island or one of those games that is all about subverting expectations, in which case, good luck, because that's very, very difficult to pull off well. This is my silly example of something that you don't need to tutorialize, right? We've got two game mechanics. Shooting causes damage. I don't know if you've ever played a game that has this mechanic in. It's quite rare. It's quite rare to have a game with shooting in it where shooting causes damage, but let's just imagine a weird world where that's your main game mechanic, is you shoot things and they take damage. And then we have this other game mechanic that there are red barrels and they explode when they're damaged. Now, obviously, my player is an idiot, and they're not able to put those things together and understand what will happen if they shoot a barrel. No, it's from the I'm from the red barrels explode when damaged universe. Yeah, so this is a mechanical relationship that if someone wants to play a game about shooting, they probably understand this relationship already, right? And even just the fact that you've made the barrels red indicates something. In fact, if I picked up a shooting game and there were red barrels and those barrels don't explode, I'm going to be disappointed, because you're now flying in the face of genre conventions in a way that reduces the fun of the thing that you've made, right? So in that case, I would expect barrels to just be a boring color, because red indicates that they explode, right? So I have some knowledge of another game or a whole set of games that I'm carrying into your game, and that means we do not need a tutorial step that says, hey, shoot the red barrels, that will cause them to explode, and then people nearby will be damaged by the explosion. If you've never seen a barrel explode in real life, then you haven't lived. This image over here hasn't loaded, so I'm not sure what it is. But I guess maybe here I was thinking about the I was thinking about the tolerance that people have for amounts of text. Let me just see if I can get Okay, there was supposed to be a screenshot of a game over there. I'm going to quickly play about a minute of this Twine game that I think helps to illustrate one of the points I'm making. Sort of, in a very roundabout way. This is a Twine game by Michael Lutz called Tower of the Bloodlord. Orchestral score, strings, horns, radio chatter, military jargon, iridescent orb, the earth from space, in quick succession overlays of flags, green spiderwebs of communication stretch tenuously from continent to continent. They shiver, break, reconnect. Skybox. Private? Shouts instantly recognizable voice and screen actor Keith David, who is your sergeant. Fire when ready. You turn around. Heavy machinery rumbles somewhere. You stand in an ad hoc shooting range, sandbags stacked in an inscrutable formation. 3 red targets have been set up a few yards ahead. In your hands you hold an MP5 submachine gun. We don't have all day, Private, says Sergeant Keith David. That is probably not his name. I'm going to press the right trigger because I know that's what I should press. You shoot through the targets. Pop, pop, pop. Left to right. Like reading. Nice job, Private, Sergeant Keith David says, loud enough that the other PFCs standing nearby can hear his praise. This is a game where Michael Lutz thought it would be amusing to recreate a Call of Duty game in a text game engine. And it's kind of really drawing attention to what I'm talking about here, which is that if I've gone to play an action game, I don't expect to be reading a lot, right? Which is why what makes that game funny is like making a literary Call of Duty game. So understanding your players can include a bunch of different things. Like if your game looks very cutesy and childlike, players are going to expect it to be less punishing. If your game has like some sort of literary pretension to it, like it is a half a visual novel or it is a very puzzly game, players are going to be more tolerant of having lots of things to read, right? There's all of these things to bear in mind, and try not to think about players as one big homogenous mass, because like what games they're used to playing, what type of game they think they're playing here, all of these things are going to factor into what kind of tutorial, what type of learning process you take them through, that they're going to be kind of willing to go through in order to access your game. Green barrels to heal you. Jobo in the chat said there's an awkward tension between slow rolling mechanics so as not to overwhelm the player and trying to be honest about what the game is about. Yeah, I agree. But I think if you're at that point where you can see that that is a challenge and a problem, then that's a challenge and a problem that is never going to go away, right? You can never design design out of the process. You can never solve these problems so that you don't have to do them, right? And I think if you're at the stage where you're thinking, oh, I don't want to overwhelm players, I've got all these mechanics, what cadence do I introduce them in? Then you're basically at the point where you're doing the type of game design that I'm encouraging you to do here, which is just being thoughtful. And that's what all you can do, really, is be thoughtful, judge the situation to the best of your ability in terms of what game you're making, what resources you have, who the game is for. This is what design is. There isn't a magic bullet. There isn't a way that you can always get it right first time. You really just have to make judgments and, try and structure what you're doing in such a way that if those judgments are wrong, then you don't have as much work to do to put them right, which is, and again, one of the reasons why I was talking about in a prototype or in an alpha, don't build a polished AAA game tutorial. Do whatever is the simplest way of giving people the information, even if that just means like writing it on the floor in entrails like you're playing Dead Space or something, even if that seems tacky, not what you want to do in the final game. You know, your prototype, your alpha is not your final game. It's just a thing to test if people enjoy the game generally, and to learn this stuff about, you know, what in the game do people not get? What do I need to teach them more or more slowly or repeat more times? All of that kind of stuff. So much of this is really contingent on where your game is in the process of being developed. And if it's very, very early on, then you can make some assumptions about what information players need in order to get on with your game. But also those early stages should be about gathering this information about what players need to learn and what players struggle with conceptually in your game. And this is really the big takeaway, which no one ever wants to hear, is that, you know, the big takeaway is always just you've got homework. But so many design things come back to this first bullet point over and over again. And this applies to tutorial design and it applies to general game design. A lot of people don't have a good practice of doing this, right? And maybe it's something you just need to do for yourself. Or if you've got friends that you talk to about game development, then maybe you can organize a way of doing this regularly with certain things. But generally speaking, a lot of us are not in good habits of like playing good examples of things analytically. And when I say with a paper and pencil, I'm not exaggerating. I'm literally saying, you know, if you're at the stage where you need to design the onboarding and tutorial for your game, and you're making, I don't know, you're making a Metroidvania, and it's mostly the same as Hollow Knight, right? You go back and you play Hollow Knight, you sit there with a pencil and paper, and you write down what you learn in different orders, even down to like, this teaches me that, you know, this is the point where I learn how to jump. This is the point where I learn that walking off the screen takes me to another level. All of those kinds of things, because the mental map that you have. Someone was talking about mental maps in the chat earlier. When you've played a game already, you come away from it with a mental map of that game that bears no relationship to what it felt like when you were right at the start of that game. So in order to really understand how a similar game onboards players, you have to go back to it with a very analytical mindset to deliberately look at that. And your memories of how that game felt to learn, like, I can't imagine what it would be like to be onboarded into Hearthstone now that I've been playing it for 10 years. And the process is probably totally different, but I don't have a memory of that at all. So make sure you go back to your inspirations, look at what they do, take a note of what they do and what they don't. And this might be particularly helpful because this will help you with some of the stuff we discussed earlier about, like, when is it okay to take a mechanic for granted, right? So again, let's say you're making a deck builder, you go and you play the tutorial of Slay the Spire, or you're making a sort of a bullet heaven game, so you start up a new Vampire Survivors save and you see what it tutorializes. What I would want you to look for here is anything that surprises you by its absence, right? Because if there's anything that the game doesn't tell you about, then that's interesting, because that starts to point towards, okay, this is such a standard feature of a genre that the devs don't even feel like they needed to tutorialize it. And, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have played this and got on all right with it, right? So have a look for that. It's hard to check for the absence of something, but you know the game, you know what's in it, and you will know if something is surprising by its absence. And then lastly, you can never fully copy something. Your game is going to be slightly different. You need to question the approach, understand the approach other people have taken, and like copy the bits that work, but you don't want to copy everything because your game is going to be slightly different in some ways. Or, you know, maybe your game is coming out after more people have played this type of game, and that means that the kind of language of the genre has moved on in some way, and you need to be aware of that as well. Lots of good comments in the chat. Dustin said design is tension and where you relax and enhance it deliberately, stressing out humans. Yeah. Yeah, and Sam, that's a great point as well. Sometimes people copy mechanics that don't work outside of that game. And this is why you can never just like wholesale copy another tutorial, because your game is going to have slightly different things about it. And again, like if you're doing everything the proper way, then when you get to the point where you need a polished tutorial because your game is going to go out and start being tested by people you don't know and stuff, it should already have been tested by people who are maybe a bit closer, maybe in the same communities as you, and who can tell you what they struggled with, or who can show you if they video it, who can show you, oh, I missed this bit, or, you know, I skipped this tutorial where this thing was only explained once, and actually that could be a piece of information that is always available if you approach the kind of tooltipping in this way and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's like we know the game too well because we've built it. We know what the game is, how the game is supposed to be played, and we can't know what other people need to know in order to play the game unless we do this in stages and just start with like a test group of 5 people and see what they struggle with. Then kind of take it with a pinch of salt because they may or may not be the target audience for the game. They may or may not know the genre, and then you just build out incrementally from there. Mario says, your character speaks kind of like the gun in High on Life. So making a tutorial that is also kind of flavorful and thematic and has like characters being themselves in it can be very, very challenging. But I think the payoff for doing it very well, it's like you get the kind of Portal type examples of like I gave earlier with Wheatley, where it's very, very charming. That's like a great moment in the game. I would say if your game is supposed to be comedic, then factor that into the tutorial as well. And think about ways, because people don't want to do a tutorial, right? So how do you make the tutorial rewarding, right? You can put literal prizes in it, like someone mentioned earlier in the chat, or you can make the tutorial sort of have this kind of comedic, funny element to it, right? And again, some of this comes down to the tone of the gameplay. Like, if your humor is cruelty towards the player, then maybe you find a way to incorporate that in the tutorial. Like, you tell them, press A to open the door, walk forward, and they fall down a hole or something like that. That can be a very funny way to like onboard people into a particular type of humor if your game is supposed to be funny in some way. So it can work. Very, very challenging though, because you're doing writing, you're trying to do comic timing and match that up with gameplay and teaching and all of that kind of stuff. So just looking through the suggestions in the chat. If you're watching this as a VOD as well, please leave any suggestions on things we can cover for this. I do a monthly live lecture like this on a broad topic. We've done them on narrative design before. We did interface last month. This is like tutorials and onboarding, which you already know if you've just watched it all. So yeah, looking for like broad topics that we can cover in this sort of format for like 60, 90 minutes or something like that. There are some really interesting questions in the chat, but some of them are way too technical for me. Like Jobo said something about playtesting against, you know, NPC AI, trying to figure out how I'm going to do that without also having a level that's in relatively final form. It's not something I would be able to like advise on directly because it's just too technical for the sort of stuff I do. Shmup game design. How do we make the first level memorable? I mean, we've had a few people ask about doing some level design stuff, so maybe we could incorporate that together and use some examples from Shmup. So maybe next month we're gonna start thinking about level design. I'm not an expert, but I can regurgitate stuff from a million other places and then talk about places where I've done level design and like what I learned as I was doing that. Yeah, Seamus, you're talking about gamifying language learning as well, which is it is one thing to teach people the name of something, and it's totally another for them to actually be able to use that in any context, right? Night Stroll said, if your audience is still struggling to get stuff, uh, what would you focus on to find the problem? So I would look at noise. So we talked a little bit about this early on. So right at the start, I was talking about, is the game self-explanatory, and do you have like helpers and reminders in the game? So things like contextual pop-ups that tell you which button to press to do a thing, rather than just saying once in a tutorial, press A to jump. Is there a way we can kind of show that in the interface consistently so it's always there? These kind of things I would make sure you've done first. I would also think about, when you teach a particular skill that you want players to have, is it in this context where they don't have too many things to think about? Or is it in this context where you've got loads of other stuff on the screen and it's fighting for attention with all these other things? And then the other thing is, do they do it, or do they use the thing that you're trying to teach them enough times to remember it, right? So the punching example I gave a minute ago, it's not that the mechanic is complex, that when I punch I heal myself. It's not a very intuitive mechanic, and that means I need to do it more times to learn it, because if I just do it once, then it's like, well, it's not obvious that punching a guy heals you. So the game just needs to require me to do that more times. So maybe it just needs a level section where I don't have any guns for a little while or something like that, Yeah, Mario's response there is quite helpful. You need to watch the testers and not help them too much as well. Like, watch them. Like, when I used to run playtests at the first studio I worked at, we had these sort of chairs where you could someone would have an iPad and be testing the game, and I would sit 45 degrees from them so they couldn't see me and I could see what they were doing on the screen. And we'd explain the playtest to them at the beginning, and I'd say, don't worry if you get stuck. That's kind of why we're here. We're testing to see what things people get stuck on. Don't worry if you get stuck. No one's judging you. And if you get stuck for longer than about a minute, I'll help you and get you unstuck. But, getting stuck is kind of the point, because we want to see which parts don't make sense. And then I'd sit there and watch them. And you watch where they get stuck. And that's really where you need to be taking notes and saying, they get stuck here. Rather than letting them verbally report stuff. Because, as I've said before, when people get stuck on a game and then unstuck, they maybe don't remember it unless it was really frustrating, because once you're over that hump, it's not relevant. You don't store it in your brain. You just kind of get on with things. So when you're testing for things like that, like learning game mechanics or just general game UX, you need to watch and take notes. It's much more of a observation-based art than about like hearing what they have to say about the game. Sam Hain said, "Is the end game not the true gameplay, not the middle?" Yeah, I think so. But I think the midpoint of a game is where you're sort of experiencing the game as what it is, right? And then in a lot of kind of action arcade games, ideally you have an infinite end game, which is just like for sickos that want to keep going. But I guess what I was trying to get at is the early part of the game is designed to be onboarding, and that's why it's going to have stuff missing from it, because they gradually add things in until you get to the midpoint. This is one of the reasons why, like, I think someone who's played Vampire Survivors for 10 hours could make a good Vampire Survivors game. I think someone who's played Vampire Survivors for 1 hour probably doesn't actually understand what's great about that game. And I've played enough Bullet Heaven games to see that kind of people don't really understand that what made Vampire Survivors pop off was the metagame structure of it and how it builds over time and all of this network of secrets that is in the game. So I think if you've played that game for 10 hours, you haven't seen everything in the game in terms of content, but you've seen the general structure of it to the point where you can maybe understand how to make one of those games well. But I've seen so many Bullet Heaven games where it just seems like someone has played an hour of Vampire Survivors and copied that bit at surface value and not really understood the meat of the game, the middle of the game, the game with its like most of its mechanics unlocked, you know? Yeah, Canny made a very good point. Sometimes when players don't understand a concept, it's because the concept can't really be understood. And it actually wouldn't make sense to you as a designer if you think too hard about it, right? Um, how to spot that though? I don't know. I mean, it's kind of I was thinking about the role of documentation the other day, because I think most of the time, if you're making a game on your own, you don't actually really need a game design document. A game design document can be helpful to make you to like help you think through certain things, but you don't really need it as a roadmap, because you can just vibe things out and follow your intuition and stuff like that. But that is the kind of situation where writing documentation might help you a fair bit, because if you write down a series of statements about what happens in the game and you read it, and when you just explain it in plain English, it doesn't make sense. That's a good example of something where it's like, yeah, okay, that probably needs to change, or the metaphor needs to change of like what the object's representing and stuff like that. Like, why do I collect wood to build this building that looks like it's made out of stone? That kind of thing, right? That's the sort of thing where if you just write it out as a sentence, it's very clear that it doesn't make sense. But you know, the big caveat with playtesting as well is always just to understand who is doing the playtesting, because you don't want to get data from a playtester who is just totally unrepresentative of who will eventually play your game, and then change the entire game based on someone who is like just not your ideal player. And that's very difficult to make that judgment. So I would make sure you know who your playtesters are and you know a bit about them, you know? Yeah, removing as much text as possible can be a good challenge. Again, it depends on the game and the tolerance of the audience, how much text you can have. But even then, there are some really just broad UX best practices, like, you know, if you have a symbol in your game for an attribute, use the symbol in the text. Don't be lazy and put the name of the attribute when you should use the symbol. All of these kind of things that are just general good UX things for games rather than anything specifically to do with tutorials. So I'm going to wrap things up now, because I feel like we've been over everything we needed to. I think the theme for this live lecture next month is going to be level design, It's a difficult topic to cover. Like, I've done very different types of level design. I did some level design on Amateur Surgeon, which is like, you know, a level is like a slideshow of different body parts that you interact with different ways. And then I've done some 3D level design that was totally different. So even just what level design means can vary a lot from game to game, which is kind of the general theme of what these talks end up being. It's like, understand the game you're making, and what it needs, and you know, there are no universal rules for these things. There are general kind of quirks of human brains and human culture that we can understand and incorporate, but there will never be like a catch-all. You should always do X, and I would always. That's a good one. It's a good one to end on. I would always never listen to people that say always or never. Thank you for joining, and I will keep an eye on the chat after I've stopped the stream and just see what else comes in. But if you are a Patreon subscriber, I will upload this video to Patreon so that you can watch it without ads. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, you can watch the version with ads, and I'll set it so that there is an ad every 3 minutes. So you'll probably learn one interesting thing per 3 or 4 ads, something like that. And if you're on the Patreon as well, I'll upload the slides so that you've got them as a resource. I know a couple of people asked for those before and have found them helpful. So I don't make lots of stuff that's specifically for Patreon, because the whole point of this channel is I don't want stuff to be paywalled. But when there's little things like that I can do that only take a minute, then I do them, because you deserve them for helping me to afford to not become homeless. Thank you very much for joining, and I'll see you all soon.